Hello, Adam's child. Welcome to this week's sermon all about the apocalypse that is less talked about, and one that was cut short by the bombs that ended civilization as it was once known on October 23rd, 2077. This silent apocalypse is completely overlooked, but with enough time, its slow and insidious nature would have unraveled the pre-war world. The steady expansion of radiation into every facet of daily life, the slow poisoning of the environment due to unchecked powers, the degradation of human health due to the poisons in household objects and food, and the awakening of a mysterious, latent evil mark the prolonged, suffocating end of the world that was never fully realized. So crank up the rads and let's examine the apocalypse that few saw coming and no one could have prevented. The most prevalent and silent threat that lurks behind every corner and invades nearly every aspect of daily life is the presence and the effects of radiation. Some of us know that the glow is a gift from Holy Adam, but to those not ready for such a gift, the effects can be dire. It is difficult to adequately convey the scope of this issue. The world of Fallout in the pre-war was awash in radiation, from the alarm clock that wakes you up in the morning so you can drive your nuclear-powered car to work on time, to the parks and lakes where you pass a lazy Saturday afternoon with the family, and everything in between. While the rest of the world's countries languish under a desperate lack of energy, the United States stands as a stark outlier. The US is able to fuel homes, industries, and an all-out war against communist China, mostly through nuclear energy. Some of the greatest scientific achievements in the 21st century have been breakthroughs in fusion technology, the newest, cleanest form of nuclear energy that has the potential to meet the immense demands of Fallout's technologically dependent world. Fission power generation, the older method that generates a lot of radioactive waste, is much more widespread, however, with nuclear technology a mundane, household sight that is slowly feeding an apocalyptic specter, unseen or ignored by so many. The implications of widespread radioactivity is well known. The health risks range from elevated cancer risks to straight-up death, depending on the dosage, and in the world of Fallout, things are even worse, since radiation can induce all manner of mutations, or even turn you into a ghoul with a prolonged life and perpetually rotting body. Radiation also affects wildlife, mutating it, enlarging it, or even making them living vectors of radiation themselves. Any way you slice it, if left unaddressed, Fallout's problem with radiation will bring the modern pre-war world to its end. The amount of radioactive waste in any and all forms throughout pre-war America is, frankly speaking, absolutely absurd. Traveling through and inspecting the wastelands so many years after the events of the Great War can make it hard to determine what radioactivity came from the nuclear bombs and the associated fallout, and what was there prior to Earth's atomic baptism. Pools of thick, radioactive liquid dot the landscape of the wastes from the coasts of California to the Commonwealth. But that doesn't mean the radiation is pre-war in origin. In order to determine the extent of the pre-war radiation problem, there needs to be a direct source for the radioactivity, like some radioactive waste barrels, or old rusting nuclear-powered cars, or something equivalent. Erring on the side of caution means that not every single sludge pool is considered, since something like that can arise due to radioactive material being concentrated by natural processes like rain and runoff over decades. With that in mind, I identified over 80 specific locations across all the games that speak to the pre-war's obsession and susceptibility to radiation pollution. It doesn't matter where you find yourself or what year it is, scattered across the wasteland are thousands of old, leaky, improperly shielded, radioactive waste barrels, identifiable with their yellow and white paint job, often piled together haphazardly. They litter ravines or sit at the bottom of ponds and lakes, slowly leaking their contents. Alarmingly, these barrels are not properly shielded, since getting close to them is enough to get irradiated. Why are they so prolific across the wastes? And who is responsible for them? Are businesses to blame, producing waste as byproducts and cheaply disposing of it somewhere discreet? Were communities or even individuals generating this waste, perhaps through at-home reactors, like the so-called Fission Pal home generators? Or how about other domestic waste, like old worn-out fission batteries, or even radioactive waste car coolant from people wrenching on their cars in their garage? Crescent Canyon in Fallout New Vegas appears to be one enormous dumping site, the largest unofficial dumping site in all the games, where people likely just threw their waste off the cliff edge and considered it as good as gone. While it seems absurdly irresponsible for people to just dump radioactive waste, since the Fallout universe is heavily inspired by the 1950s and 60s, people may not think that it's a big deal, similar to how it was considered good advice to dispose of used engine oil by pouring it into a hole in your yard in the 50s and 60s. Given how prolific nuclear energy is in the Fallout world, there are a myriad of possibilities that could explain all the dumped waste, but there is a sinister side to this as well. It's one thing if your dumb old neighbor throws out some radioactive waste in the forest down the road, but it's another when businesses whose entire existence revolves around the proper disposal of waste fail to even do that properly. The Greener Pastures disposal site in the Capital Wasteland was a business that supposedly had the expertise, the means, and the space to properly handle radioactive waste for customers who couldn't do it themselves. As of 2277, all that's left are several piles of barrels across a large area, rotting away and leaking into the ground. This waste collects in large irradiated pools of sludge, attracting multitudes of mutated post-war creatures. This sorry excuse for a disposal site was even known to pre-war America as being an environmental and health threat, but nothing was ever done. There is no evidence that anyone did anything to store the waste more securely or remediate the environment, and as a result, nearly 200 years after the Great War, the waste continues to spew forth radiation, contaminating everything from the air, soil, and groundwater. Many other official waste management sites similarly failed to adequately deal with their radioactive waste, like the Hub City Auto Wreckers outside of Boston. They made money primarily by buying and storing old wrecked nuclear-powered cars, but even though they weren't handling nuclear waste directly, like Greener Pastures, they had been cited several times in the pre-war for mishandling nuclear material from the cars. This mishandling resulted in radioactive pollution of the environment, ground, and all those that visited even centuries later. Nowhere is this kind of catastrophe best illustrated than at the scrapyard in Fallout 3, which is marinating in pools of radioactive sludge from all the old cars, an example of the unintended dangers of the atomic golden age. Perhaps most alarming are the several instances of waste being stored in, on, or right next to metro stations in the Capital Wasteland, posing a risk to anyone that are just waiting for their train. Some instances of radioactive waste were actually intentional and primarily meant to dissuade people from exploring certain areas. One such example is the abandoned waste dump in Appalachia that was strategically placed near the entrance of a senator's personal bunker. The abandoned shack in Fallout 4 was hiding a government surveillance facility, and once again, radioactive waste was left out in barrels near the entrance to keep any curious visitors away. This is such a short-sighted use of a material that lasts thousands and thousands of years, polluting the environment just to keep trespassers away. A similarly selfish but altogether different approach was used at the Emmett Mountain disposal site in the Appalachian Wasteland. The facility was a hastily conceived official radioactive waste disposal site run by the Department of Energy. It looked completely legitimate. Rather than storing barrels out in the open and exposed to the elements, they actually dug tunnels into the hillside. However, it was constructed poorly, but not before it was filled with all manner of radioactive waste, most notable of which are barrels that were filled with hacked up super mutant bodies. These bodies came from the West Tech Research Facility, who was experimenting with FEV, testing it out on the nearby community at Huntersville, and trying to cover up their unethical and inhumane testing. By storing the super mutant test subjects' remains amongst other incredibly irradiated waste at Emmett Mountain, they made it difficult for people to ever discover evidence of their misdeeds, especially after a cave-in at Emmett Mountain that only furthered the radioactive pollution. Even the best-case scenario in the whole series ended up an abject failure. Federal Disposal Field HZ-21 is a very special site because it was built well to safely house long-living radioactive waste, with the most prominent feature being the ominous and wicked-looking cement spikes jutting out of the ground at odd angles. This site was part of what was dubbed the 10,000-Year Initiative, which was a project that endeavored to make a nuclear disposal site visually distinct and scary or intimidating looking to prevent people thousands of years in the future from disturbing the area, which would still be radioactive, since any signs, writing, or perhaps even common symbols may not be understood by humans thousands of years from now. They instead experimented with large, easily seen, and dangerous or ominous-looking structures like giant cement spikes to communicate the idea that people should stay away. The federal disposal field in Fallout is inspired by the real-world project given the much less memorable name, the Long-Term Nuclear Waste Warning Messages Project by Sandia National Laboratories, who is associated with the Department of Energy. They came up with a number of ideas to communicate through architecture a feeling of unease or fear, and one such idea employed a spike field, which had large concrete spikes protruding from the ground at irregular angles. Even with all this planning and effort though, the federal disposal field ended up just as radioactive and polluted as any other site that we have discussed. After the underground structure had been completely filled with waste, for some reason, they continued to get shipments of nuclear waste. Issues with communications meant that employees had to find a way to deal with the extra waste all by themselves, which they did by the tried and true method of just leaving it all out on the ground, where it remains over 20 years later, covered in a yellow radioactive haze. Although nuclear waste should be disposed of differently from other kinds of waste, it is no surprise that in the pre-war, it is still found in conventional landfills across the wasteland as well. Dumping sites, both official and unofficial, are universally an ecological disaster, so it should come as no surprise then that the logistics of transporting nuclear waste is similarly fraught with negligence, with really only one lone exception. Crashed semi-trucks and trailers can be found in every single game, spilling their radioactive contents onto the ground. It's not just trucks though. In Fallout 3, there are 2 grounded tugboats that have also lost most of their radioactive payload, where it rests on the ground, leaching into soil or mixing in the water for years upon years. Additionally, in Fallout 4 and 76, train cars can be found simmering under the heat of nuclear waste barrels, having lost their payloads on or near the day of the Great War. These crashes were likely caused by the incredible calamity, disruption, and destruction of the thousands of nuclear bombs that detonated across the US. So not only are these crashes understandable, but they're expected. Although tragic, that's not so much the issue. What is the issue is the stunning lack of safeguards and special equipment used when transporting the waste. In nearly every case, they are just the normal, leaky, and unshielded barrels transported in unshielded semi-trailers or on the deck of a tugboat rather than securely in the hold. The nonchalance regarding radioactivity and lack of proper protocols to protect people and the environment at large is alarming, since crashes and accidents were for sure happening in the pre-war days. One single instance of special care is recorded in the town of Searchlight in Old Nevada that has come to be occupied by the NCR. Inside the fire station are 2 trucks with casks that contain radioactive waste that have laid undisturbed and safe for 200 years. That is, until the Legion opened them in a covert operation to strike against the NCR. Whatever nuclear material that was in these casks were so incredibly radioactive that merely opening them was enough to send a pulse of radioactive energy through the entire camp, killing and ghoulifying nearly everyone and heavily irradiating the whole place. Whatever this nuclear material was, it was insanely radioactive, possibly to a degree that we haven't seen before, given its effects on an entire settlement by just opening up the protective casks. It would make sense, therefore, that such a material was given extra special care and protection, but this is one single instance of adequate shielding and perhaps adequate handling out of a handful of criminally negligent examples. Accidents, of course, happened in the pre-war, and with the amount of material being shipped around and the inadequate safety measures, dangerous accidents are happening and at a rate that would horrify anyone in the real world. The issue of prolific radiation in, on, and throughout nearly everything in the pre-war world is made worse and indeed enabled by those interested in the money that could be made generating the waste and the money saved by improperly disposing of it. So far, a lot of the radioactive waste is easy to identify because of the hard-to-miss yellow and white waste barrels, but there is a skin-sloughing amount of toxic waste being dumped in a not-so-visible manner. Lake Quannapowitt in the Commonwealth Wasteland is, by post-war standards, pretty decent, and in the pre-war a very beautiful lake that was a popular recreational spot. Little did people know, however, that the largest power manufacturer in the region, Mass Fusion, was secretly dumping radioactive waste into a pipe that contaminated the lake. Although the adjacent monitoring station was tracking pollution levels and had identified elevated radiation, heavy metal, fecal matter, and other hazardous pollution, no one with any power raised awareness or did anything to protect the lake or the people that used it. This perfect storm culminated in a bass fishing tournament where nearly 30 people became ill just by exposure to the lake, and another 2 had to be treated for radiation burns when their boat capsized. Although easily the worst story of hidden pollution, Lake Quannapowitt is far from an isolated case. Another lake in the Boston area was similarly polluted by that pinnacle of ethics, Mass Fusion, and scientists had also identified elevated levels of pollution along the northeast coastline. In Pittsburgh, the Abraxodine Corporation, well known for their successful line of detergents and cleaners of the same name, began secretly dumping experimental compounds not far from their chemical complex. The local rail transport companies stopped any and all waste shipments because the substance was eating through the rail cars and destroying them. So, Abraxodine resorted to secretly dumping the experimental substances just nearby. Shortly after the Great War erupted, the toxic substance reacted with radiation, causing rapid expansion and an energetic exothermic reaction that resulted in the destruction of an entire city district, making it uninhabitable except for the most hardened people and newly mutated creatures like trogs. More often than not, the companies responsible for the devastating pollution were never held to account, much like Hornwright Industrial in Appalachia. Hornwright Industrial was one of the most successful mining companies in Appalachia, becoming increasingly profitable by embracing automation, to the extent that they built one of the world's largest mining machines known as the Rockhound. The Rockhound is a bucket wheel excavator, much like the real-world bagger excavators produced in Germany, and caused so much pollution that they were compelled to create air scrubbers. But this story doesn't have a happy ending. The scrubbers were so good at what they did that Hornwright figured that they could make money mining the polluted air. And to make sure it was as profitable as possible, they lit old mine shafts on fire to produce even more pollution, with those very same mine shafts still actively burning and spewing radioactive ash into the air. Very rarely were there actual consequences for these disasters, but a radioactive spill by RadKing, one of the leading aerospace companies in the nation, did contribute to their downfall. That allowed a rival company, Robco Industries, to successfully perform a hostile takeover. And what has this atomic optimism, I've chosen to call it, led to? A world where radiation is encroaching on all fronts into everyday life. It's at home, at work, and already well on its way to changing the world in imperceptible ways. Lobsters and crabs are mutating larger and larger. Two-headed cows will start being born with increasing frequency. Mole rats are increasing in size, aggressiveness, and speed, and even the humble and mighty ant has become a ticking time bomb as they build nests in the increasingly irradiated soil of the atomic age run amok. The nightmares we are accustomed to in the irradiated wasteland are already taking shape before the bombs even fall. The world is asleep and dreaming, but doesn't realize what form these dreams will soon take. Although the slowly tightening grip of radiological disaster is the largest threat ignored by most people, that doesn't mean it's the only one. So many products and items that are bought, sold, and used on a daily basis have a variety of hazardous substances that should raise a few eyebrows. Humanity has a long love affair with lead. It has a low melting point, it's very heavy, it can be used as a sweetener, and is a very useful additive to many things, including paint. It wasn't until the 20th century that the dangers of lead as a neurotoxin led to efforts, pun intended, to remove it from consumer products. It appears, however, the Fallout universe did not follow this path, and lead is found in very concerning places. In Fallout 76, all colors of paint and cans of paint have enough lead in them to be a harvestable product when junking the item. In fact, you get more lead than oil or steel, which are the only other components. Even worse, all food cans, be they a plain can, tin can, or aluminum can, also contain lead, meaning all canned foods has at least trace amounts of lead in them. Perhaps they are still using leaded solders to seal the cans, much like the real world did up until the late 20th century when it was phased out, but this added lead contamination in food is just one more straw added to the camel's back. Perhaps the most disturbing ways that lead is being used in the pre-war world is in the use of several baby and children's toys. The toy alien, the toy car, and particularly alarming, the baby rattle, all have lead in them, indicated by the crafting components. Inspecting these toys, there doesn't seem to be any great reason for them to contain lead, unless it's part of the toy's paint. Considering how much children put both their hands or even their toys straight into their mouths, these toys present a very troubling vector for lead poisoning, causing damaged kidneys, the nervous system, and long-term reduces mental cognition and increases behavioral problems, which honestly that might explain Raiders. With lead poisoning the minds and bodies of pre-war Americans with no end in sight, it should come as no surprise that there is one other major health risk in over a dozen household products, and that's just from the stuff that we know about for sure. Asbestos is naturally occurring and is made from a number of minerals with similar characteristics. In the real world in 19th and 20th century, its remarkable ability to insulate and complete inability to burn meant it was incorporated into thousands of products and home construction. Asbestos creates serious health issues when inhaled, ingested, or even touched, as the fibrous mineral lodges itself permanently in the body, physically damaging cells due to its sharp needle-like shape. This leads to inflammation and can eventually lead to cancer. Many applications of this hazardous substance in the Fallout world would mostly be considered safe. Things like coffee and teapots, where the asbestos is likely contained within the walls for insulation, and wouldn't be exposed to people unless taken apart. You know, exactly like what we're doing when we scrap them. However, it is also found in products that would cause direct contact, oven mitts, and for some reason the Catch the Commie board game, although that's not clear what part of it would have had asbestos. Cigar and cigarette boxes contain asbestos, which was also a real-world practice to control humidity levels, but that could lead to physical contamination. The most consequential of all the products, however, are the ones that would naturally lead to inhalation. Chalk in the Fallout world contains asbestos, meaning that manufacturers are not properly vetting the minerals they are using, since deposits of chalk, which is often made from talc, can have asbestos. Chalk dust is a natural result of using chalk, which can easily be airborne and breathed in. Fire extinguishers apparently have asbestos in the fire retardant for the same reason that chalk has it, since talc is used in some extinguishers and would spread airborne asbestos everywhere, which can be observed should the extinguishers explode. Considering how many mundane products contain asbestos, it is reasonable to assume that it is found in even more places. creating ticking health time bombs in industrial workers and threatening the health of the average person who is going through life, getting unknowingly irradiated, accidentally ingesting lead just by handling toys or paint, and touching or breathing in asbestos. That's all part of a normal day. Accidentally introducing toxic substances into your body poses enough of a health risk that willingly consuming hazardous food seems like an absolute death wish, but such is the reality of the pre-war world. Nuka-Cola is the premier drink of choice across nearly the entire pre-war USA, and the massive success and profits from the drink allowed the Nuka-Cola Corporation to expand to dizzying levels. A basic Nuka-Cola is radioactive, with one bottle being equivalent to 3 rads, and also has 120% the daily recommended dose of sugar, and that is just one bottle. One of the newest flavors prior to the Great War is Nuka-Cola Quantum that has strontium-90 added to the drink, which is a radioactive isotope. A single Quantum has twice the sugar, so 240% of the daily recommended dose, twice the carbs, twice the caffeine, and nearly 3 times the radiation. Somehow, Nuka-Cola was able to get FDA approval for the Quantum, possibly due to their massive wealth and influence, and the drink was determined by them to have a healthy amount of radiation. Strontium-90 is a fission product that, due to its size and charge, can take the place of calcium in the body, meaning it concentrates in the bones and can lead to bone cancer and leukemia. It is therefore somewhat fortuitous that Quantum was not widely distributed prior to the Great War, since the Great War erupted before the official release. The Nuka-Cola formulation easily leads to a dependence though, something that a number of people in the post-war suffer from themselves. Such an addiction would have made it even more difficult for people to do right by their bodies and their health and stop drinking Nuka-Cola. Sunset Sarsaparilla was a competitor to Nuka-Cola, and while the soda did not have radioactive ingredients, whatever was in the soda could cause a number of side effects when consumed in large quantities. These effects include kidney damage, loss of sight, joint inflammation, bronchitis, and organ rupture, amongst other less serious things. The processed foods in the Fallout world put a heavy emphasis on shelf life and not having an expiration date, with some of the biggest and most well-known brands and foods achieving this through unknown means. Blamco mac and cheese, Instamash, and Fancy Lads all lack any expiration date, and over 200 years after the bombs drop, they appear to still be edible. The perfectly preserved pie is the best example of this, appearing to be something similar to cheesecake with a whipped topping that, by all metrics, should not have an indefinite shelf life, and yet it can be found in the post-war years as pristine as the day it was made. Logically, anything that normally decomposes but is able to stay both edible and not deteriorate in quality or presentation over hundreds of years would not be good for your health. We may not know exactly what the ingredients are for many things or how they are able to stay edible for such lengths of time, but one product has revealed its ingredients, and it's not great. Cram is a processed pork product similar to the real-world Spam and is a relatively simple food. Pork byproducts, salt, and heavy water are the 3 main ingredients, with heavy water being, well, certainly a choice. Heavy water has the same chemical formula as normal water, but replaces the hydrogen atoms for an isotope of hydrogen called deuterium. It's actually not inherently radioactive, and heavy water does not impact health in small amounts, but in larger quantities, it can cause dizziness and interfere with cell division. And I don't think I have to be the one to explain how bad that can be. The most popular cereal of the pre-war, Sugar Bombs, is nearly exploding with sugar, but we're not sure about any other ingredient. It is telling, however, that in the post-war, Sugar Bombs contain the necessary ingredients to turn jet, an extremely potent and powerful chem, into ultrajet. Additionally, Sugar Bombs can be added to rocket fuel in Fallout New Vegas, turning an already explosive fuel into an ultra-energetic reaction that results in the destruction of the REPCONN rockets. All this evidence points to a food industry that is unwilling or unable to put the health of their customers and the public at large over their own profits at much higher levels than our world, with so much of the food that people consume carrying hazardous amounts of radiation, sugar, preservatives, heavy water, and other unknown but apparently potent additives. We can only imagine the low standard of health that many people experienced and how that would have continued to worsen as time marched relentlessly forward. Of all the things dragging civilization to its grave, no one could have predicted this last hidden threat. Several individuals and groups have made contact with otherworldly forces, whether by accident, like with the 19th century archaeologist Lorenzo Cabot, who found a mysterious crown that bestows him powers, or on purpose, like the Dunwich Corporation, who are actively uncovering ancient and arcane objects like the obelisk or the sacrificial chamber. Very few people are aware of this threat, like the Black Hall family and their mysterious tome, the Krivbekna, secretly being fought against by a Christian missionary, but the exact goals of these people and forces are just as nebulous as what effect these beings or powers would have on the world. But it can't be anything good. Fallout's world is one of atomic optimism, a belief and a hope that the potential of nuclear technology can help humanity overcome the great challenges that it faces, that through this fundamental force of the universe, the world will be elevated to a level never before seen, and the American way of life will be shown as undisputedly superior. Atomic optimism means something else as well, an optimism so strong and so intense that it allows for those that espouse it to be taken advantage of. The unflinching faith that all their technological progress doesn't have any downsides, that the powers that be who make the food that stocks the shelves with infinite lifespans wouldn't poison them. The unwillingness to sue for accountability until those at the top can't be stopped. Even though there were some that could see the devastating truth, the world of Fallout was always meant to come to an end, even if it didn't go out with a bang from nuclear salvos that would tear through the sky, but with a labored and drawn-out whimper. Thank you for being here with me. I'm interested to hear what you think. Do you believe that the Fallout world was always doomed to fail? Do you think the pre-war world could have been able to turn things around and combat the myriad of issues that were chipping away at their world? I want to thank my wonderful supporters on Patreon and YouTube. They fuel this channel's reactor, and they allow me to make the content at the pace that I do. If you would like to show appreciation, you can join the ranks, or, just do whatever you want. I'm just glad you're here. A huge thank you, of course, to my top tier patrons, Acrid B, Gardner Minshew Simp, Tessa Storm, Dami Double, Tapey Papey, The Alt Vault, Juan Vader, Good Old Welshire, Braden Daniel, Tyler Eaton, Owen Balzer, and 94 and Ballistic Banana. Adam is pleased. Take care of yourselves. You are an important part of Adam's kingdom, and I will see you soon-ish. Glory to Adam.